Today we are going to cover a few more events from the 1990s as well as the election of 2000, all right? So first off, a little bit of pop culture here before we get into the real history of it. There were a lot of new types of music that were becoming popular in the 1990s. You have this style called grunge, a Seattle-based hard rock genre, and then of course rap, which had existed since 1979, but didn't really become mainstream popular music until the early 90s. Okay, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because music became the preferred mode of expression and entertainment for a lot of Americans in the 1990s. Also, sports. It was seen as kind of a golden age of sports as well. A lot of the, the athletes that we still think of today as the best in their craft, people like Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan, making their sport more exciting than it had ever been in the 90s. So, in a lot of ways, the 90s were a good decade for America and for the world, which is why I bring up this stuff. But in other ways, it was a very difficult, violent, and uncertain time, which is what we're going to talk about now, right? So, first off, the World Trade Center bombing. Now, whenever you think of a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York, of course, the first thing most people think of is 9/11. And yes, that is the terrorist attack that destroyed those buildings. But 8 years before that attack, there was a bombing on the World Trade Center. Okay, there was a truck bomb. There was a bomb placed in a truck parked beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And with the explosion, it was intended to bring down one tower, which would topple the other. This was one of the first of many terrorist attacks on U.S. soil of not only this decade, but then several since 2001 as well. So this bombing of the World Trade Center by a radical Islamic group killed 6 people and wounded about 1,000. Now we get to O.J. Simpson. All right, you guys probably have heard of O.J. Simpson. And he is famous, of course, because of the trial, which we're about to get to, that he was a part of in the 1990s. But he was an all-star football player first. He was the Heisman Trophy winner in 1968 with USC, very successful running back in the NFL throughout the 1970s. But then in June of 1994, OJ was charged with double homicide, okay, charged for the deaths of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ron Goldman. All right, when their bodies were found on that day in June 1994, people said, all right, where's OJ? All right, because OJ was her ex-husband and he had threatened her multiple times to kill her, things like that. And so the first person people thought of was OJ. All right. Now, this trial lasted for over a year and it was highly televised. Okay, OJ was arrested upon this suspicion. The investigation took place. They found OJ's DNA at the crime scene, his blood, his hair, his fiber. He had a motive to kill her, all right? And it just looked like a slam dunk. And people really obsessed over this celebrity murder trial for a few reasons. One, he's a celebrity, all right? Everyone knew who he was, and having a celebrity of this stature convicted of double homicide or on trial for double homicide is just a huge deal, all right? Also, it had a race element to it because just 2 years prior to this, there was an event in Los Angeles, the same place that the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman took place. In LA, you have several white cops beating up a black kid named Rodney King, and there were all sorts of riots about it, tons of violence that took place in LA over this police brutality. And those policemen were declared not guilty. All right. So a lot of people said that even though OJ looks very, very guilty here, a lot of people kind of wanted him to be declared innocent in order for like the two wrongs to make a right. Okay. So like the first one with Ron Goldman, you have a bunch of white policemen who should have been convicted who weren't. And now here you have OJ Simpson, a black man who probably should have been convicted, but in the end he was not. All right. So even though there was overwhelming substantial evidence against OJ, and most Americans did believe he was guilty, the jury still found him not guilty of both murder charges, and he was able to walk free. Okay, so a lot of people see this as an example of a celebrity or a rich person getting special treatment, which definitely does happen in the criminal justice system. There was a domestic terrorist attack that took place in April of 1995, and that was the Oklahoma City bombing, another truck bomb explosion. This was in downtown Oklahoma City, and 168 people were killed. I mean, that's just so many for a terrorist attack. 168 people were killed, 680 were wounded. And if you look at that building there, you can see the front of the building was all glass, and that's the reason why the killer chose that spot for the truck bomb. He also chose it because it was right next to a playground. It was hoping to kill children. Right, just spine tingling, just how evil you must be to plan something like that. One of the men responsible for this was put to death, and the other one is still in jail. Right, but certainly a tragedy. One of a friend of mine actually was in Oklahoma City at the time, and she got to meet Bill Clinton that week whenever he came to give a speech and console the people who were hurt by this bombing and who knew people who were killed. Right, so certainly a difficult situation in our country's history. Now, throughout the 1990s, Osama bin Laden, a former Saudi Arabian prince who had really gained power fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, was rising to power in the Middle East. All right, he founded Al-Qaeda in 1988, and this was a radical Islamic terrorist group. So bin Laden fought, as I said, against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, at which point the U.S. was actually supplying arms to the Muslim fighters there. Eventually, the Soviets did leave. Bin Laden kind of took credit for that, even though it was mostly American weapons that did the job. So bin Laden interpreted the Soviets leaving and the later collapse of the Soviet Union. He interpreted that as him having the ability to take down a superpower. Okay, in addition to just being an evil person, he was also an egomaniac and thought way too highly of himself and thought that he had actually taken down the superpower of the Soviet Union. So after the fall of the USSR in 1991, there was only one superpower left in the world, and that is the United States. So he then made it his priority to take down the United States, the people who had previously helped him defeat the Soviets. Huge act of betrayal. In 1996, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda declared war on the United States. Now, the United States, mistakenly, I think, did not declare war on them in response, because Al-Qaeda is not a country, it's an organization, and we had never declared war on an organization before. We had only declared war on countries before. And so Bill Clinton did not declare war on them. And we really did not take bin Laden and Al-Qaeda as seriously as we should have. And later on, we paid the price for that. Another event from the 1990s that was really tragic was the death of Princess Diana. She was a member of the British royal family in the 80s and 90s. She was the former wife, at this point ex-wife, of Prince Charles, who will be the next king of England. And she's the mother of Prince William and Prince Harry of the UK. So in 1997, Princess Diana of the UK, she died in a car crash in Paris. Now, she was very young at the time. She's a young, beautiful woman, and the media was really obsessed with her. The paparazzi were always around her, always trying to get pictures of her. She was a very influential figure in England and really in the entire world. And she was very young at the time of her death. Okay, so it's certainly a tragic event here. Her death was also a point of contention because the paparazzi, that means like the media, the press with the cameras, they followed her everywhere, including here in Paris. And when her car crashed, they didn't help her when her car crashed. They just kept taking pictures, trying to get a good shot of Diana. All right, so certainly partially to blame there. The Prime Minister of the UK at the time, his name was Tony Blair, and he had the monstrous task of comforting a nation after the death of their princess. Okay, another really sad event, Pearl High School, all right, just 10 miles down the road from here. Pearl High School right here in Mississippi. In October of 1997, a 16-year-old student shot 9 students, killing 2 after murdering his mother that morning. You probably heard of this since this took place very close to here. It took place before you were born, but still was a big event here in Mississippi. A couple members of our staff here at Brandon High School were actually teaching at Pearl or students at Pearl when this happened. So the person, the murderer here, he was a member of a satanic cult, and he specifically targeted Christians in this mass shooting. This was one of the first ever school shootings, especially at a high school. And then 2 years later happened a much more famous, much more well-known school shooting, and this was Columbine. Okay, two students at Columbine High School in Colorado. They killed 15 students and injured 24 others before killing themselves. Right, so just this lunacy of just walking in places and blindly shooting people and just killing people for no reason whatsoever. People who are not a threat to you at all is just something unthinkable to most Americans at the time. And sadly, there has been an increase in school shootings over the past 15 years. So finally, on this page here, Osama bin Laden, going back to him, he and Al Qaeda, they committed several terrorist attacks throughout the Middle East and Africa. One in Tanzania, one in Kenya, one in Somalia, just really all over the place. And then in October of 2000, they bombed a U.S. ship, an American ship off the coast of Yemen. It was called the USS Cole. So with this attack, 17 U.S. soldiers were killed and 39 were wounded. I mean, this is an act of war. That is clearly an act of war. You have innocent people being killed by a foreign power, and it certainly is an act of war in every traditional sense. But the U.S. responded to this act of war by doing absolutely nothing. Okay, just horrible how we didn't do anything in response to this. If we had retaliated and actually went to war with Al Qaeda after this, it's very unlikely that 9/11 would have ever happened. But because bin Laden and Al Qaeda got away with this with no consequences whatsoever, no retaliation from the U.S. at all, that inspired them to go bigger next time with the September 11th attacks, okay, which we'll talk about next class. Now we're going to talk about the election of 2000, all right? So the Democratic and Republican nominees for president in 2000, all right, this is at the end of Bill Clinton's presidency, and the two people running were Al Gore and George W. Bush. Al Gore was Bill Clinton's vice president from Tennessee, and he was the Democratic candidate. And then George W. Bush was the former governor of Texas and the son of George H.W. Bush. He was the Republican candidate. Now, both were seen as honest people, experienced people, well-liked candidates. I remember in 2016, most people said, I'm just going to vote for the lesser of two evils, the one I dislike the least, right, Trump or Hillary. And that was certainly true for a lot of people in 2016. In 2000, it was a little bit different. Both were seen as pretty likable people, and people voted for who they preferred. So the election of 2000 was the closest election in all of U.S. history regarding the electoral votes, which is what matters. And it all came down to Florida. So Florida had 25 electoral votes. And before the Florida results came in, on election night, Bush had 246 votes and Gore had 266 votes. So that meant whoever won Florida would surpass the 270 vote mark and win the election. Okay, so it all came down to Florida. It was razor thin. It was super close in Florida. That's a swing state. About half the people there are Republican, half are Democrat, and people really did not know who was going to win that state. All right, so first when the results came in, CNN and all the others said, okay, we're calling Florida for Gore. Al Gore has won Florida. And then an hour later they said, oh, actually, we are now taking back that projection. Bush has actually won Florida. Bush has won Florida. Oh, wait, this just coming in. Too close to call. Too close to call. And literally for days, that was the results. They kept counting them, and it was literally too close to call. Okay, so when all the results had finally come in, it showed that Bush had very narrowly defeated Gore in Florida, and therefore he won the election. But since it was so close, and it was such an important issue here, it literally determined who is going to be our next president, Al Gore requested a recount of the votes in Florida, and this occurred over 2 weeks, all right? Now, he specifically requested a recount in a couple of heavily Democratic, heavily liberal counties, and that was suspicious to a lot of people, saying, hey, why don't you want to recount in the Republican or conservative counties? Why just the counties that you probably won? So this recount, it was seen as suspicious to some people. It took place over 2 weeks, and at the end, the results said that Bush had indeed defeated Gore in Florida by the tiny, tiny margin of 537 votes. That is a razor-thin margin to win a presidency by, and therefore Bush won the presidency. But Gore was still skeptical. Okay, he was still not happy that the results did not swing his way, so he contested these results and demanded another recount. He demanded a full recount of everywhere in Florida to take place. All right. Now this actually went to the Supreme Court because if you request one recount, okay, that's acceptable sometimes. All right, that's seen as a right of candidates. But once you start requesting more than one, like recounted, recounted, okay, recounted again, then it's like, okay, well, when is this ever going to end? So this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stopped the second recount on December 12th and officially declared George W. Bush to be the winner. So the election of 2000 was really controversial for people because this was one of the first and only times in U.S. history when the loser, Al Gore, actually received the majority of the popular votes. Okay, he received about 500,000 more individual votes than George W. Bush. But in U.S. elections, the electoral votes, the electoral college, is what matters more than popular vote. Okay, so those usually go hand in hand. Usually, whoever wins the popular vote also wins the electoral vote. But in 2000, that did not happen. Also in 2016, that didn't happen. That's the way it goes sometimes. But in America, it matters who wins the electoral vote because that's more of a survey over the entire nation instead of which places have the most population. So the first controversial issue that George W. Bush had to confront when he came into office in 2001 was the issue of embryonic stem cell research. You may have never heard of this, but this is the scientific process of using cells, lines of stem cells from frozen human embryos, which are early stage babies, in order to research certain diseases. Okay, so an embryo is when the baby's still in the womb, like first trimester is when it's called an embryo, and that's what the process does. And in order to get these stem cells from the embryo, you have to kill the embryo, and that's why it was so controversial, because you have to kill the embryo to test its stem cells. And if you believe human life begins at conception, then this, just like abortion, is seen as murder, right? So it's literally an issue of life and death for a lot of people, and so you can understand why it's so controversial. But those who supported stem cell research said that killing these embryos would serve the greater good because it could save lives in the long run through the research that is conducted on them by curing diseases like Alzheimer's. So President Bush had to make this very difficult decision that has to do with science and morality and faith, and that's just kind of the state of ethics. Whenever you have new scientific developments, you have to make decisions about what's right and what's wrong, since those are issues that other people haven't had to face before. So his decision was that he would allow stem cell research on embryos that have already died, but he would not allow more embryos to be killed for the purpose of stem cell research. And a lot of people said, hey, this is a really good policy. It sounds fair. You're not going to waste the stem cells of the embryos that have already been killed, but at the same time, you got to say no more killing of the embryos to preserve what life we can, all right? So a lot of people said that this was a really good first decision by George W. Bush. And also one thing he pushed in his first 6 months of office was No Child Left Behind. This was his education policy, and he was all about education. George W. Bush, he was all about reforming education, making the education system better, okay? And No Child Left Behind established standards-based education reform with the purpose of making teachers like me more accountable to high standards and raising the expected level of student achievement. One of the ways it did this was by increasing state testing. Okay, so a lot of the state tests that we take, they started under No Child Left Behind back in the early 2000s, right? Both No Child Left Behind and then Common Core, which Obama replaced this with, both of those increased state testing. Now, this program did not create national education standards like we have now with Common Core, but it did allow states to create their own standards and made sure they did. It did increase the federal government's role in testing, funding, and monitoring student achievement. And as I said, it was replaced by President Obama with his program Common Core, and that did develop national standards for education, making the government more involved in education. So during George W. Bush's first 6 months in office, he thought that he would be known as the education president. It says that right in his biography I read recently. He thought he would be spending most of his time on matters dealing with No Child Left Behind and fixing the education situation here in America and increasing student achievement. However, suddenly, on September 11th, 2001, it became very clear to him that his presidency would not be defined by his education policies, but would be consumed by something else. And after this day, after 9/11, which we'll talk about next class, Bush realized that he would be spending most of his presidency fighting terrorism and taking all necessary measures to keep America safe.